excited today because we're going to have a great conversation with a really good friend of mine, Kelly Rosati. And if you are new to the community of Women of Welcome, we are a group of Christian women who are dedicated to pursuing Christ-like welcome towards immigrants and refugees. And you can be a part of this community on Facebook and on Instagram. We do have a YouTube channel as well. So if you're missing videos or you're hungry for more, you can visit us there. We also have a private Facebook group. So if you've got questions and you're afraid to ask them, or you want to connect with women who are wanting to go deeper and figure out how they can show up more personally, we've got kind of a safe space for you to engage and dialogue with other women like that. And that's on our private Facebook group. You can find us at Women of Welcome. So today we're going to be talking with Kelly Rosati, who is the CEO of KMR Consulting, and she is also the executive director of the Flying Horse Foundation, which is a charitable foundation that seeks to meet the needs and advance the well-being of at-risk youth and families in Southern Colorado. She has served as a board member for the March for Life's national organization, and she is the former VP of Child Advocacy at Focus on the Family, which is where she and I met. She is a longtime advocate with over 30 years experience in nearly every aspect of the pro-life movement. And why that's relevant, I'm going to get to that in 1 second. But over the past 10 years, the reason why I'm so excited to have Kelly on is that she has been a personal mentor to me and become one of my best friends. And she has so much wealth of knowledge and personal experience in a lot of human dignity areas. And fun fact, she used to be my boss when we both worked at Focus on the Family a few years back. And so January is the Sanctity of Human Life Awareness Month. And it's a time where pro-life advocates call attention to the vulnerability of preborn children and seek to elevate the truths about the violence of abortion against babies and their mothers. And so in our community, we frequently talk about the importance of being holistically pro-life and how immigrants and refugees are really a piece of that bigger pro-life puzzle. And so today, Kelly is going to talk with us and help us clearly connect the piece into that puzzle. So, Kelly, welcome to our community. Let's bring her in.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here, Bree.
Yes,
I'm very proud to see you doing this really important work.
Well, I was just telling Kelly, I always have notes. I think you guys always probably see me looking at some notes. And with Kelly, we have these kinds of conversations almost on the daily. And so it feels weird to kind of like have notes about where we're going with the conversation. But Kelly, thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
Oh, good. Okay, so let's just dive in. Let's start by laying some foundation for this conversation. January is Sanctity of Human Life Month. You've got the March for Life in Washington, D.C. that happens every year that looks to bring awareness about the Roe versus Wade decision that happened back in 1970s. And in the traditional sense, being pro-life is defined and really confined to the preborn children and abortion issues. But biblically, that seems to be too narrow of an ethic. Why is that?
Well, I think that's the exactly right question, first of all. And I would also say that it hasn't actually always been quite this narrow. Early in the pro-life movement, there were lots of discussions and there was much advocacy related to the end of life. And there was a bit more of a holistic understanding, never, of course, diminishing the role of advocacy for unborn children. But to your question about the biblical perspective, I think this is the key to understanding it all. And that is the concept of imago Dei and the dignity of every human person. Without that as a grounding, I think it becomes difficult to make a holistic pro-life case, frankly. I think if you don't have that understanding, it's much easier to think we should focus in only on unborn children. But I think when you start with that biblical foundation of the imago Dei, that every human person is made in the image and likeness of God and is worthy of protection and is beloved in his sight, that sets you on the right predicate then to have conversations about why life matters both in and outside the womb.
Right. So there's, obviously kind of a Webster's dictionary of what it means to be pro-life. And what you will see in that is you will see it's about abortion issues and centers around unborn children. Whereas the biblical definition is much broader because we see the connectivity in the scriptures. So what would you say, just flat out, what is your definition of what it means to be pro-life?
I think it's to value the human dignity of every human person, both born and unborn, and recognizing that as believers, we are called to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, which will always apply to unborn children, and will also always apply to already born persons whose lives are at risk and who also need for us to raise our voices on their behalf.
Perfect. Yep. So this is fun. I love talking with Kelly about this because, like I said, we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. We know that there is a spectrum of vulnerable populations that fit under this broader pro-life definition, and they're connected in this biblical sense. But where do you see the everyday overlaps and connection points, specifically
Sure.
with immigrants and refugees, and it fitting in that broader definition?
You bet. Well, I was thinking about this last night in anticipation of having this conversation. And if you don't mind, I'd like to actually back up a little bit, if it's okay with you, to kind of when when a huge light bulb went off for me, related specifically to this issue. And it went back to my time working in ministry and being surrounded by lovely Christian people at church and at work and in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And when issues of immigration would arise, I noted a really disturbing, dark trend, frankly, among Christian people that I knew and loved. And that was that the way they talked about immigrants and refugees was so dehumanizing. And it was so contrary to being a follower of Jesus. And it was so upsetting to me. And it was upsetting not only because of how wrong it was, but because of how prevalent it was. And because of how people didn't give it a thought. And no matter what I said to these people, I couldn't seem to get them to understand that being pro-life had to do with how we viewed and how we spoke about people. Again, and I think you all say this very well, that doesn't mean you have to be for ABC as it relates to the specifics of immigration reform. It doesn't mean that you're getting a top-down prescription on every jot and tittle of the legislation, but it sure does mean that you better be talking about people made in the image and likeness of Almighty God with the dignity that He has imbued to them. And so that for me was a huge awakening about how much work we had to do. I could not understand how in one breath I was hearing about how important it was to be pro-life and rightly saying that we needed to do what we could to minister to moms facing unexpected pregnancies and to uplift the human dignity of the unborn child. And well, in the very next paragraph, might be hearing people speak in very derogatory ways about immigrants and refugees. And frankly, not even having a clue that there's a difference between immigrants and refugees. So kind of the tone and the dehumanization is what I think is the entire predicate for this holistic pro-life perspective. As to the practical, I would ask people to think about these things. When you hear news stories about people in life rafts, in rickety homemade boats, trying to flee persecution and torture and starvation and preventable disease, and you hear about the death that comes from those things, and then you hear about the death that comes if they don't make the journey, those lives lost matter just as much as unborn lives. Now, this is really important that people understand what we're saying. And I feel like for you and I, Bree, who have spent many, many years advocating for unborn children, we can't be easily dismissed when we say this. No one is minimizing the importance of advocacy for unborn life. And maybe you and I can come back and talk about that later on if you want more. But in order to truly reverence unborn life, we have to pay the same reverence toward born life. And so in those practical scenarios that I just listed, why would we care less about those lives lost than we would about the lives of unborn children? And that's kind of from a predicate standpoint and from a practical standpoint where it all connects as far as I can see from the scriptures.
Right. And I remember when we were both working at Focused on the Family, and we were developing a resource that had this kind of comprehensive ethic all kind of mapped out for folks. And I remember hearing a sermon where, at the time there were a lot of heartbeat bills that were trying to be passed around the country. Mm-hmm. And I remember this sermon where this pastor said, why would the heartbeat of a preborn child matter more than a heartbeat of a migrant child at the border? And it was just like something just broke in me. Like, that is exactly it.
It's true.
The reason why Christians are so staunchly opposed to the violence of abortion is because it is this absolutely mind-boggling situation, intentional situation that we're putting vulnerable children in. And yet the very policies that we either choose to engage with or not are intentionally causing harm to other children. They just happen to be at the border.
Yeah. Now I want to say this because I can hear the objections in my head as you speak. And I will say this. I think one slight modification to what you just said, which was very, very eloquent, would be this. Sometimes that the policies that we're talking about that will extinguish a heartbeat of a migrant child, those are not as intentional as the intentionality of premeditated violence against unborn children. But here's what's important about that. To the dead child, it doesn't matter. The child is the same dead, whether the child is unborn or whether the child is a migrant child at the border, and whether the legal in the law, we call it the mens rea element, the state and the condition of your intention, whether it was intentional and knowing or whether it was reckless endangerment. The result is the same and the lives are lost. And that is all we are saying, is that followers of Christ, as people who believe in the sanctity of human life, these lives all matter. And I need to tell you something very important. I will be probably naively hopeful until my dying breath that people will come to understand and embrace this from a very heart level. I think it is so important. But for those who still couldn't get there on the heart level, I would offer a very practical argument for being holistically pro-life. And it looks a little bit like this. In the pro-life movement, we know how to communicate to those who already hold our position. We know how to get them fired up. We know how to get them activated. We know how to have them raising their voices as they should on behalf of unborn children. We also understand that those who hold a different perspective about this issue know how to do the same with the folks in their camp. So we have two camps of folks that are very clear on where they stand. In order to effectively advocate for unborn children, we have to reach people with more ambivalent views about abortion, frankly. We have to reach the vast numbers of people who frankly aren't comfortable with it, who don't like it very much, but who also really are not going to go all the way over into the camp of the pro-life community. In order to actually save lives, we have to win these people over. And in my 30 years doing pro-life work, I have found nothing more effective than being able to demonstrate, not just in word, but in deed, that you value and that you speak and that you live a whole life perspective. Nothing is more persuasive to that person in the middle who we need in order to effectively save lives from abortion. And I know I can get a little long-winded here, but Can I just tell you one story about that?
Yeah.
And why I feel so passionately about that? It had to do with the genocide that was happening in Darfur many, many years ago. And I was horrified in ways that are hard to describe about what the people of Darfur, made in the image and likeness of God, were enduring in the midst of a genocide, how their lives were being snuffed out, how they were being targeted and exterminated. And then I was equally, maybe not equally, but pretty almost equally upset by the fact that I heard nothing about this genocide from the pro-life community. I heard nothing about this genocide from predominantly white evangelical spaces. And I was so grieved. So in the community where I lived, we formed a coalition and we tried to do the work that you do on any of these kinds of issues to stand up for the people of Darfur that were being exterminated off the face of the earth. I hate that word. This is what was being perpetrated against them. And I did this hand in hand with a woman who was a very strong pro-choice advocate. And I was in relationship with her. We worked together to bring attention to this genocide and to mobilize, to work on that issue. And she knew where I stood on abortion and on protecting unborn life. And I knew where she stood on her desire to protect women's autonomy. And we worked together. And by the end of the time we worked together, I will never forget, she said to me, I bet you're wondering how I can be against genocide in Darfur, but not be concerned about abortion and what happens to unborn babies. She made the connection. But before, if she hadn't seen pro-life people working holistically pro-life, she had no time for hearing about justice for unborn children. She was wrong to not care about justice for unborn children, but she couldn't see it because she didn't see a pro-life person working for justice for already born children. And once she did, her eyes opened. Now, I'm not saying she became a pro-life advocate overnight, but it began the process of changing her thinking and her understanding of justice and of human rights and of what it means to belong to the human family, and considering how unborn children may fit into the mix.
Yeah, and I love that, because one of my very first meetings, did I lose Kelly? Oh, I don't know if I just lost Kelly or not. Looks like I just did. Okay, we lost Kelly. We will get her back, I promise. Hold on, let me send her a text. One of the things that I will say is I have a similar story to that. I'm telling her to link back on. Lost you. So we'll get her back. But I have a very similar story in the fact that one of my very first meetings that I had when I was entering more deeply into the immigration space. Hold on one second. Let me tell her what to do. Go back. The same link. Don't you love technology? Okay, so I was in a meeting and I was talking with a group of people who had been in the immigration space for a really, really long time, and they were just way more progressive in other areas than I was. And I remember talking to them and telling them that Christian women care about these issues of immigrants and refugees. And there was just kind of like a lot of disbelief in the room. And hi, Kelly's back. Great. So I was telling you about a similar story that I had kind of had. And that is when I first kind of got into this, diving deeper into this space of immigrants and refugees, I was in a room full of people in DC, and I was the only conservative evangelical in the room. I think I was probably the only Christian in the room. And I remember I was telling them about the work of Women of Welcome and what we were doing. And I knew that this group of people had more progressive ideas than I did. And they were pro-choicers, most likely. I didn't know that for sure, but I just kind of could get that feel. Well, at the end of my talking about what we were doing with Women of Welcome, I had a woman who looked very much like me. She was older than me, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said, I just want you to know something. I'm not going to change my views on abortion. I had not talked about abortion once. I had said that because of my convictions as a pro-life evangelical, as a pro-life Christian, that this is the reason why I cared about this issue so much and why thousands of other women did. And so I hadn't even said that word. I hadn't brought it up. And she said, I just want you to know, I'm not changing my views on abortion. And I said, I guess I wasn't expecting you to. And she just, like, tears came down her face. And she said, you're telling me that pro-life women will work with me on this issue?
Mm.
And I just felt so grieved in that moment, because it was like, wow, we have not been building bridges. We have been like building camps and tribes and keeping people out where there is so much common ground to be had. And it was just this beautiful moment where it was just kind of like the atmosphere broke, and it was kind of like, yes, we're going to work together and it's going to be great. And who knows what will come of that? Like you said, it's not like there's this overnight changing of whatever, but I mean, that's where the Holy Spirit comes in, and you just let him do his thing. And yeah, I'm with you totally on that. And I think you and I have had lots of conversations with people where they look at us kind of like, but aren't you pro-life? And I will say this, sometimes Sarah and I get a little bit nervous to share about other work that people are doing in this immigrant space, especially when it comes to politics and when it comes to helping people tangibly on the ground. Because a lot of people who are doing this work, it's not that Christians aren't doing this work, but a lot of people who are really doing this work and have been doing it for a very long time have very different views on other human dignity issues. And therefore, like, when we share something, people will be like, oh, they're working with Hillary Clinton, or they're working with this person. I can't believe that you would be promoting this kind of work. And to that, I would say, how do you expect us to make progress if we're not going to build bridges? We're not promoting their ideas. We're partnering with the work that they're doing.
Right. And let me just also say this about that. That objection only applies one way. People in our community know very well how to work with other politically conservative individuals and organizations that, frankly, are not pro-life on matters related to unborn children. Somehow we've been able to, I say we, I don't mean we, that community has been able to figure out how to work with pro-choice people who support a certain approach to taxation that they think somehow is super great and have elevated to a very high level. Or they have been able to work with people who are very supportive of the business community or the national defense industry, or all kinds of other folks that are not pro-life on abortion. But they have managed to do that. So the, oh my goodness, we could never, only applies one way. And I think, again, that goes back to the a lot of what we're seeing emerge now within our community, which is conversations about, wow, where did things go wrong? And trying to project the idea that a faithful following of the scriptures, a faithful following of the Savior of the scriptures leads to either perfect alignment with either conservative or liberal ideology, with either Republican or Democrat platforms. The reality is it lines up perfectly in neither place. And anyone who wants to suggest that while it may not be perfect, it's 90% great on the Republican side or 90% great on the Democrat side, just in my view, just isn't thinking deeply enough. I think it's much more complex. And I think there are issues where sometimes you're going to align and conform to what may be described as something that's politically conservative, or with something that's politically progressive, or with something that is part of the Republican Party platform, or with something that's part of the Democratic Party platform. And so I kind of like to see that it's all being tossed up, and we have the opportunity to do it afresh with a focus and really a laser beam prioritization on where should we go from the scripture, and where should we go from the heart of Jesus for every human person, with particular emphasis on those who are suffering, those who have been marginalized, those who are vulnerable, both born and unborn.
Right. So let's dig into that just a little bit, because you and I both know that many traditional pro-lifers who are really existing in that preborn space are pretty resistant to what they would call a redefinition of what it means to be pro-life. And so pull back the curtain just a little bit for us, since you've been behind the curtain. Pull that back for us and let us know, why is it not, why is there a resistance to accept all of these other vulnerable populations?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say about that is I think there are parts of the rationale that make a lot of sense. Frankly, I think that when people hear, so when traditional pro-life folks hear people who are passionate about justice,
right,
talking about being pro-life holistically and for born people as well as unborn people, I think that it rings hollow to them if those people haven't already been advocates for those who are unborn. And if they haven't already, or if they're not willing to be. So I think the consistency is so important, and it cuts both ways. So if you're somebody who can get really passionate about speaking up for justice for immigrant children, but really never want to say a word about justice for unborn children, that's what the traditional pro-life community is afraid of. And honestly, I think that's a very valid point. But beyond that, I want to say something about your premise. Being for the sanctity of human life in a holistic way is not a redefinition. There is no doubt, if you're going to claim the phrase, the sanctity of human life, whether you look at Catholic social teaching, whether you look at the history of Christian involvement with the vulnerable populations, the word sanctity of human life do not only mean one thing. Now, someone could very legitimately be an anti-abortion advocate. And by the way, I don't say that derisively. I'm anti-abortion. But if all you do is advocate for unborn children and you refuse to use your same voice to advocate for migrant children losing their lives, or for people whose lives are lost in a genocide, or for people whose lives are lost to starvation or preventable disease. If you will not do that, that's not being about the sanctity of human life. If you don't care about life at the end, if born lives don't matter to you, that does not fit with the sanctity of human life, but you can still be anti-abortion. Bree, I'm going to stop talking for a second because I'm about to lose battery. So let me fix that while you talk.
Okay, sounds great. Okay. Well, what I was also just going to say to that is, that is exactly right. You've got traditional pro-lifers who are saying, don't claim to be pro-life if you're not going to also consistently advocate for preborn lives. And so when you say, I am doing this because I'm pro-life, I'm in this space because I'm pro-life, and pro-lifers, traditional pro-lifers, don't see you advocating for the unborn, they get a little skittish because they're like, all right, so please don't say that you're pro-life for this vulnerable population, but that you aren't going to use your voice, like Kelly said, to speak up for this. So it lends itself to the credibility of what you're saying and to the consistency of what you're saying. So it looks like we probably lost Kelly again, which is a major bummer. But I'm going to continue with the conversation because it's a good one. And what I would say is a lot of us are trying to have these conversations with our family and friends, and it can get heated pretty quickly. It can be frustrating and hurtful, some of the conversations that we engage in, because what we're really trying to do is we're trying to bring people along. We're trying to communicate the consistency of this ethic. And one of the questions I was going to ask Kelly, and if she jumps back on here, then we'll have this conversation with her. But how do we effectively have conversations with traditional pro-lifers about the consistency of the ethic? And I think it goes back to starting with a biblical definition. sometimes when you're following a lot of these traditional pro-life organizations, you'll see people saying that they are either resisting a redefinition of what it means to be pro-life. And to me, I would ask them, where are you getting your definition? Is it the Webster definition? Is it the Webster dictionary that is defining why you are so passionate about being pro-life? Because if it is, then that's just a really small space, right? That is narrow. But if it's from a biblical perspective, they would be very hard pressed to find any scripture that would suggest that you could prioritize one vulnerable population over another. And so what I would always go back to is, what is the biblical foundation for why you are pro-life, and talk about the consistency of that. The other thing that I was going to switch and to kind of talk with Kelly about, hopefully she'll get to join back on here in a second. Let's see if I think her computer just completely died. And maybe we'll have Kelly back on here. But the other thing I was going to talk with her about is, let's see, there tends to be, let's see, what did I have in my notes here? Oh, I was gonna ask her to kind of talk through what her advice was in some of the conversations she's had that has wounded her, and that maybe she'd give us some advice on that. So we'll have Kelly back to talk about that for sure. But then the last thing I was going to ask her, obviously, is the same thing we ask all of our guests, which is, what is Christ-like welcome? And so we're going to have Kelly back on as soon as she can get her technology up and going, and then we'll have kind of maybe like a part 2 conversation. So I'm going to save that for that. But the thing we're going to talk, oh, she's back on. It's amazing. Can you hear us?
I'm so sorry.
I feel like it's just like this amazing. I mean, I know how you are with technology. So the fact that you keep coming back to me is amazing.
It's very embarrassing. My computer was plugged in. There was something wrong with the outlet.
Okay. All right. Okay. Tilt your computer down just a little bit so we can see your face. Okay. So the thing I was going to talk about next with you was a lot of us are trying to have these kinds of conversations about being consistently pro-life across the board with our friends and our family. And we tend to get in some really heated conversations that can be pretty hurtful. And a lot of people can just end up leaving those conversations wounded. What would you say, what would be your best advice for entering into those conversations well? Yeah.
Well, first I'll start with a confession. I'm not sure I have any advice about doing it well. I'm not sure I'm good at that. I can tell you what I'm trying to learn myself. And I'm trying to remember back a long time ago when I used to feel the same way that they feel. So I try to remember that I once had a different perspective. It was a long time ago, but I had it nevertheless. And so for me, something that I always have to work on, and I think goes a really long way, is gentleness, and being able to ask questions with gentleness. I think is really important, for people who are convinced that voting for a politician who makes certain political policy promises that may or may not actually result in saved unborn lives. For people who have been taught and who truly believe that believing that and voicing that is akin to them being a faithful Christian. I'm not sure there's a ton to say. I don't know necessarily that direct conversations are the way to go. I think that what you're doing here is so wonderful, giving people an opportunity to understand the difficulties of immigrants and refugees and what the experiences are, and to welcome in their own lives, allowing God to make them even more compassionate and more fully human in caring about that, caring about the lives of immigrants and refugees. I think the way that you invite people to do that is really beautiful and probably the way to go. And I don't know that I have any very good answers.
And I guess I'd also just kind of maybe add to that is just prayer. I mean, I feel like
Yeah.
the Holy Spirit really has to go ahead of us in a lot of these conversations, because sometimes we get really wrapped up in our passions and we feel, God is backing me in this. Like, I am
Yeah.
speaking the truth that I am reading out of scripture. And yet, we know that coming in with that at that level is
Yeah.
not going to draw anyone closer. It's going to put them
Yeah.
on the defense.
Yeah.
And so,
Which is really hard. It's a hard lesson to learn. I still feel like I have to learn it all the time. I don't know if you still feel this, but
of course.
one thing that happens to me constantly, and I don't know if it happens to you, is
It does.
if I'm out there advocating for immigrants and refugees, if I'm out there advocating for people to have access to healthcare, if I'm upset about things unrelated to a politically conservative agenda, I get a lot of my Christian friends being up. If I get upset about racism and want to speak against the ills of and the evil of racism and its perniciousness and its pervasiveness continuing in our culture, lots of people coming at me to talk about how I'm too brash or I'm too this or I'm too that. But one thing that is always true is those same people would never say that to me when I'm advocating for unborn children. And so, that's just been a glaring thing for me to realize, and to just try to keep myself in check from behaving in the flesh, but really trying to live by the Spirit to consistently and holistically advocate for all human life, born and unborn.
Right. And I'd also say one of probably the most effective things that I think I have experienced in recent years is really trying to listen well to what the fear is. So, I've got people who are really fearful about jobs being taken or border security, or, there's just a whole litany of things. And so when you really start to instead of telling your point, start asking questions, and then they'll probably start, and then you kind of have a starting point of, okay, so this person fears this person is misinformed about this, and vice versa. And I remember having a very heated conversation in the car with one of my girlfriends who goes to the same church I do. She's, reading the same things I'm reading. And yet we're just like completely ends of this, scale here. And what I heard from her was fear. And there were several things that she feared. And I just remember over the next several months, I mean, she's still not there, but she's at least paying attention now. Like, she's got an antenna to it. I started kind of just strategically and, shrewdly putting out information either on my social feed or dropping it into conversations about certain things that I knew that she cared about. Just some truths that I knew that were going on, that were based on fact, that were based on, economists' reports and data and all these things, and it wasn't like I was trying to fire hose anything. I just tucked it away, and I knew that was what she was concerned about. And then in my natural everyday relationship with her, I advocated gently, like you were saying. Now, I don't do that all the time. Kelly and I are both very fiery people. Kelly is actually way more controlled in her conversations than I am. But
I don't know about that, but
this is why we're friends. So we do have a question from someone just about, she says, what do you mean when you say advocate? Does that mean that you use your voice or you use your talent as your focus or whatnot? And I think we're saying it's obviously a both and, right?
Yeah, absolutely essential to do both. I think that one of the biggest failures we will always have in things that we care about is if we are people of words and not deeds. And we know that from the scripture. And so if being passionate about the sanctity of human life is important to you, you bet use the places where your voice can advocate for people who maybe aren't able to do the same, but let your life do it as well. So if you are passionate about welcoming immigrants and refugees, do it. Make sure you're doing it in your life as well, in whatever ways you can. If you're passionate about unborn children, by all means, do not just talk, but let your life speak to your commitment to the sanctity of life for unborn children. So get involved, adopt, foster, support your local pregnancy center, actually meet people face to face and be in relationship with people. And Bree, that brings me back to so much of what you were saying. I think all these things we've talked about today in terms of approaches and strategies and some tactics around how to do this better, I think they're really, really important conversations to have. But to me, as someone who's learned from lots of failure, the most important thing about it all is to do it in a way that is not tactical, is not part of a strategy, but is actually about the love that flows from your heart and is about the relationship and is about how we treat people. And that goes back to kind of where we started, which is a reflection of the Imago Dei. If every human person is an image bearer, and they are, then how we treat them, no matter how much we disagree with them, no matter how much we think what they're doing is harmful to other people, somehow, and only by God's grace, we can continue to, from the heart, treat them in the way that we know an image bearer should be treated. And so I think that's really important. It's very easy in all of this work to get very cynical. And I think is naive.
Right.
It isn't naive. It's protecting your heart and keeping it soft and not letting yourself go into rank cynicism, which can be so easy to do.
Well, that was going to be one of my last questions. Do you have two questions? And that was just it. You know, operating in these really complex human dignity spaces, no matter what it is on the spectrum. And especially, I feel like over the last 4 years, immigrants and refugees, that whole conversation, that whole space, if you are an evangelical Christian, that has been a very hard space to be in. And if you feel compassion and conviction towards entering into this space and doing it well, it's been a pretty lonely space to be in. Oh, I've lost her again. Shoot. Been a pretty lonely space to be in. And I was just going to ask her what her encouragement was for those of us who feel that way. And I think she already gave that to us. And that is that to make a choice to continue to love people, and also to make a choice to stick with the Lord and not grow or become cynical in these things. And I will tell you, that has been hard for me. It's been very hard for me to not just feel like I need to put up some boundaries and some fences to make myself feel better about what I'm doing. And yet, again, the Lord keeps saying, you're to be a peacemaker. You're not supposed to be a peacekeeper. And if you feel tired and exhausted, retreat back into me and then go out. Okay, here's Kelly. So I was just telling them the last question that I had for you was something you were just already talking about, and that is that this can be a pretty lonely space. And what advice would you give, maybe even just for some self-care, but also just advice for feeling so lonely in this space at times?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is it's particularly lonely in certain spaces. So in predominantly white evangelical spaces, it definitely feels lonely. And that brings me to my second point, which is it is a wonderful thing to realize that there is a flourishing body of Christ in all different streams of Christianity. And so I think one thing that's really fantastic is for people to be able to join hands and to join lives with people who are equally committed to Jesus and to their following of him and to the scriptures, who just simply may not identify in the same traditional church stream that you've been a part of. So I think that is really important. I think I also heard you talking about boundaries. I think boundaries are very important because, of course, it sounds so cliche, but it's so true. We'll never have anything to give to these efforts if we are not taking care of ourselves and we're so depleted. If you're in fights 24/7 with the people around you, you're really not going to be able to, as you described, Bree, stay plugged in to the vine. And as branches, we know we have to stay plugged into the vine in order to bear fruit and to be light and to be love in the world, in all of these sanctity of human life issues that we are entering into.
Right. And I have also found that even if I'm in stark disagreement with people, that still choosing, like you said, still choosing to think the best of them, still choosing to try and understand where they're coming from, that is an act of love. That's choosing to love that person well. That's advocating for the relationship, even when you feel like that relationship is exhausting or that relationship is not worth my time. We have to be people of God who say, that person is worth my time. I can have healthy boundaries about when I engage with that person or how often I engage with that person. But when I do, and I should still continue to, granted, that is an act of love, to advocate for the relationship and to seek out what really is the pain point there that could be a bridge instead of a huge gap between you. So the last question I have for you is, we ask this of every guest, but what is Christ-like welcome?
What is Christ-like welcome? I think it is hospitality and love in action, even and especially when it is inconvenient to the way that you want things to go in your own life. So I think that it is probably not Christ-like welcome if there isn't a sacrifice, if there isn't a cost. Christ-like welcome is very different than good manners, which I think we ought to all have. And I think kindness is essential. But I think where you see true Christ-like welcome, you'll see sacrifice and you'll see pain, and you'll need to continue to see love as the animating source of your welcome.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. Okay. So if you're listening to this conversation, we invite you to join us. We are a community of Christian women who are on a journey. No matter where you are, we're not trying to get you from A to Z. We're just seeking the Lord and not staying where we are, and moving towards vulnerable people that He would have us love and choose to love well. So you can follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, or you can join that private group on Facebook that I was telling you about. If you've got questions and you're afraid, you don't want to be trolled, you don't want to be attacked, we do have, which I mean is a very real thing. We know this, especially with the subject matter. We do have a safe space for you, and it's on Facebook. So search Women of Welcome and you will find the private group. And we would love to dialogue and meet with you there. So thank you so much. Thank you, Kelly. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.